Donald Trump is attacking democracy, and Joyce Vance is here to talk about what he is up to and why it is a soft coup. Welcome back to Defending Democracy. I'm Marc Elias. Let's get started. Welcome to Defending Democracy, Joyce.
Thanks for having me.
So the last time you were on, it was 9 days before the immunity ruling, and we were not sure how the courts were doing, how they were going to handle Donald Trump in that context. Now we have Donald Trump in a whole new context. So how do you think the courts are doing?
Well, so far so good, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think they're, I mean, I know my view, and I've said this, like, I think they are the most functioning check right now on Donald Trump, and I think they're doing more good than people give them credit for. But you're the expert for today, so I'm just curious. Do you think they are meeting the moment, sort of glancing by the moment? Jury is still out. What do you think?
Well, look, I'm no more expert than anyone else, but I am an observer of the courts, and I think sometimes we speak about the courts as one big, huge institution, when in fact we have at a minimum 3 different tiers of courts in this country. And throughout Trump's time in the public eye, the district courts, the trial courts, have done very well by and large, regardless of which, the party of the president who appointed them. Judges have looked at the law and the facts and decided cases on that basis, regardless of whether that outcome favored Donald Trump or not, right? It has gone both ways. But then we get into the more political branch of the courts, the 9 folks in black dresses in Washington, D.C. And I think the question you're really asking is, do we think that the Supreme Court will hold, even after they gave Trump broad, expansive criminal immunity? Maybe because they did that, might they not feel some sort of obligation to step in and protect democracy at this late stage in the game?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, I would point out for people who don't track this as carefully as Joyce and I do, Donald Trump so far is 0 for 2 in the first skirmishes in the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, they were sort of preliminary rulings and they were sort of postured oddly cases. But, at least so far, there has been 5 justices, including the chief and Justice Barrett, who have joined with the liberals to stand up. I wonder if you think that's a durable majority, or if that's these were just weird cases procedurally, and, one, I think, involved whether a TRO could even be appealed. Whether you think there's more to read into that, or you think that's, the jury's, it's too soon to know.
Yeah, I read absolutely nothing because, as you say, these are procedural skirmishes early on about TROs and appealability. And that's very different from deciding the substantive issues in the case, which are yet to come in front of this court.
Okay, so the other big question that everybody is asking me, so I'll tell you my answer and then get yours.
Oh, good. I always like to hear the answer first.
They want to know if we're in a constitutional crisis. So this is my answer, and I realize this is like strikes some people, I think, as too legalistically formal and not emotionally satisfying. I don't think we're in a constitutional crisis. I think the constitutional crisis is at a point not where Donald Trump is doing unconstitutional things, which he is, not at the point at which he is violating the law, which he is, but at the point that his administration refuses to comply with court orders. And though they are clearly playing a game of cat and mouse with a number of these courts where they, are ordered to do something, they're not actually saying, Your Honor, we're simply not abiding by your order. They're saying, oh, we didn't think your order covered this, or we thought we were abiding by your order, or, and some of that is disingenuous. But to me, the constitutional crisis comes when a judge says you are in contempt. And the DOJ lawyer says, my client doesn't care, and we're simply not going to abide by those orders. Is that am I looking at this too formalistically, too restrictively? I think you have probably sounded a little bit more of an alarm about where we are than maybe I have.
So I'm not actually sure that I would disagree with you. I think the constitutional crisis will clearly present if there is a moment like the one that you suggest. But I would zoom back out a little bit and say that beyond the issue of, that discrete constitutional crisis, that challenge to the rule of law, I continue to think that we are in the middle of a soft coup.
Okay.
The military is not out on the streets, right? Nobody with guns is forcing me back into my house and to shut my mouth. But what we are seeing is someone who is attacking all of the norms and institutions of government. You know, the basis of our government is three separate branches that are set up to check each other. Donald Trump is in the middle of collecting all the power of all three branches, or as much of it as he can get for his own. We see that most clearly with Congress, which sort of is in this supine position, letting him, run roughshod over them. He's also trying it with the courts, the threats to impeach judges who don't, go along with him. And as you say, at least for now, the courts are the functional branch of government.
Yeah. So talk more about this concept of soft coup, because I do find it interesting. And I think, by the way, it's not inconsistent. I think you can be in a soft coup and not be in the formal constitutional crisis. I think they're actually speaking about two sort of different aspects. One has to do with the administration's actions, and the other has, in my view, has to do with the more structural constitutional judicial review, Marbury versus Madison part of this. So talk more about why you think, for example, the firings and the funding freezes and DOGE constitutes a soft coup. Like, what is the contours of that?
Yeah, so I think the distinction, by the way, that you make is exactly the right distinction to make, right? The one about the legalistic implications of refusal to obey orders. And then the question of where's our government at? Are we still a democracy? Are we becoming an autocracy? And that, I mean, the reality is Donald Trump has never made a lot of bones about the fact that he wanted the powers of a dictator or at least an autocrat. And so that's what we're watching. I mean, it's fascinating. I'm not a political scientist. Sometimes I play one on TV. But we are watching him, rather than using the military take over the government, simply doing it by fiat because he says he can, right? Congress has the power of the purse. Donald Trump says, no, you don't. I do. And we see that in a number of different areas, whether it's policy, whether it's executive orders, this utterly ridiculous exercise with DOGE trying to take over the internal mechanisms of government in clear violation of the way that this is done. This is all an effort to consolidate power in the hands of the president. I think it's the ultimate expression of what you and I would call the unitary executive theory, right? This used to be a fringe right-wing theory about the president's ability to control the executive branch. With Donald Trump, it's control of not just the executive branch.
We'll be right back with more of my conversation with Joyce Vance in a moment. I founded Democracy Docket to be a fearlessly independent, pro-democracy source for news, information, and analysis about voting rights and democracy. For 5 years, it's been doing just that. If that's what you are looking for and it's important to you, please subscribe to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletters at the link above or in the description below. Yeah, so I want to categorize these cases. I think sometimes we get too deep into this case versus that case. And, it's satisfying in the moment because there's a big win or there's a big case. But I think like you said, zooming out, I put them in several buckets. So there's the I am the president and therefore I can decide who works in the executive branch. I don't care whether they have civil service protection. I don't care if they are only fireable for cause. I don't care if they're an inspector general. I don't care if they're on a bipartisan agency. I am the president. I get to hire and fire everyone in the executive branch and I get to control what they do, even if they are lying prosecutors. Okay, so that's like one line of these cases. Another line of these cases is notwithstanding the fact that Congress has the tax and spend power, I can just decide on my own, I'm going to spend money or not spend money, regardless of congressional appropriations. These are maybe the Impoundment Act kind of things, right? It's I get to decide whether I take care the law is faithfully executed or not, and that is unreviewable. The third is essentially a miscellaneous, I am the interpreter of of federal law and interpreter of the Constitution. And no one other than my interpretation, sort of unitary executive, like I get to say, what the law is, and maybe Pam Bondi gets to say what the law is, but basically nobody else gets to say what the law is. And then the final bucket is sort of the targeting enemies. I like this person, I don't like that person. Like the pardons sort of fit into that. Some of the stuff he's done, and I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit later about targeting law firms, targeting businesses, targeting media outlets, and that's kind of like another part of this. Do you have a view as to which of those is the thing we ought to worry the most about? Do we worry about all of them the same? Do you think they sort of travel the same paths in the courts? Do you think the courts will view them differently? I'm just curious, like, how do you, or do I just have the buckets wrong?
So I like your buckets. I worry about all of the above. I think you might be surprised by my choice for what worries me the most. It's the hiring and firing cases.
Me too, actually.
Well, I'll tell you my reason, right? I was a U.S. attorney for 8 long years. And for those 8 long but joyous years, one of my assigned tasks was to sit on the Resource Allocation Working Group inside of the Justice Department. And look, it's not like the president gets to decide how many people work at the Justice Department. There's something called FTEs. Congress holds the power of the purse. We're back to impoundment. And they tell DOJ how many employees it can have. In fact, they're very specific. The number of people that the Attorney General can have in his office is set by Congress. So if you want to bring new people on board, you've got to empty up some of those existing spots. You've got to fire or convince people to retire. And if Donald Trump has the ability to fire at will, he can, for instance, create a core at the Justice Department that's loyal to him and only to him. You want to be an FBI agent or a federal prosecutor, you got to take an oath. And since the Supreme Court has given him at least broad immunity from criminal liability for wrongdoing, he can do whatever he damn well pleases. The idea that we would have a Justice Department that was loyal to the president, not the Constitution, is terrifying. And now spread that out through the other executive branch agencies. DOJ is easiest for me because I was there. We can all see the problems at DOD. One of the central foundations of the Constitution is this notion of having a civilian-led military. It's also a requirement to be a member of NATO. You must have a civilian-led military. Well, that, in a strange way, is not the concern in this administration. Right. We do have a civilian-led military. The question is there loyalty, as it has always been, to the Constitution and to service, or are they loyal to an individual? Is the military just a cult of personality? So that's a long-winded way of saying I'm really nervous about the outcome of these cases because I am not 100% confident that the Supreme Court, that there's not a shifting 5-4 majority there that'll let them dive off the deep end.
Yeah, I agree with you. Look, we started with my saying, do we think that the Supreme Court's early rulings are a sign of good things? The problem we've got, I think, is that if you count votes on like where we were a year ago, okay, on unitary executive, it's got the votes. You have obviously Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, but Kavanaugh has been a very strong proponent of very strong executive power, as has Chief Justice Roberts. Chief Justice Roberts has authored a number of opinions about strong executive power. And so, the worry I have about these personnel cases, exactly what you have, exactly the way you do. There's a reason why Ronald Reagan's administration was built around the idea that personnel is policy. Because, there's only so many budget line items the President of the United States can tinker with, but if you get the people in the offices who are going to undermine democracy, they have a multiplying effect. And so I completely agree with you. And it's not, maybe Roberts backs off of the unitary executive because he worries, but boy, things don't feel very sure-footed in the U.S. Supreme Court on, whether Trump will lose all of these cases, whether it's the civil service, whether it's the inspectors general, whether it's, the Merit Protection Board. There's all of the different iterative versions of this. But I do think there is some worry that I have that the high court could go along with it.
So I worry about this a lot. I mean, I worry that it could be 6-3, frankly. This is one of those issues that could split along party lines. I'm so old that I remember when we laughed about unitary executive theory. I remember when Bill Barr wrote that sort of shameless letter auditioning to become the Attorney General, and it circulated at the White House and in Main Justice, and it talked about the unitary executive theory, which meant the president couldn't commit crimes. And I thought, well, this is crazy sauce, right? There's absolutely only about 3 people out there that'll buy this. And it turned out, no, there might well be a majority on the U.S. Supreme Court that will say that the president has way more power than the founding fathers attributed to him, at least if you believe that, if you read the Federalist Papers, which I'm still a believer in doing.
Yeah. So you mentioned just a few minutes ago that you're most familiar with the Justice Department. That is an understatement. You are very familiar with the Justice Department. You are
a little bit.
You're one of the leading experts on the Justice Department,
Wow.
and I think in this moment in history, we are all, those of us who are less expert than you, are all watching with horror as federal prosecutors are being fired, federal prosecutors are resigning, non-prosecutors but DOJ lawyers are being fired and are resigning. U.S. attorneys are sending some bizarre communications to get their questions answered, and we're not quite sure what to do. Like whether it is a few bad apples, whether this is like going to get critical mass, whether we shouldn't worry because the bulk of the federal prosecutors who do the work at the line level are all like going to stand up against this, whether the FBI is going to stand up against it, or whether like it's just going to become a politicized agency. So like, what's the scale and the scope of the current situation, and how much should we worry that it is going deteriorate into a Trump loyalist department?
So for 97% of the cases that the Justice Department does, prosecutors take the attitude that we used to take in my old office, because I was there for 25 years, and we would see a new political appointee come in, an attorney general, a new U.S. attorney, and you would say, I'm a B. I be here when they come, I be here when they go, right? It didn't matter. If I was doing drug and gun cases, the view of the attorney general didn't matter. They were going to always support those. Same for if I was going after bank fraud or terrorism, all of the above. But there are some cases that are at the core of the department's work that are influenced by the political powers that be. And the unfortunate thing about this administration is that those cases, the cases that are being politically animated, are expanding. Always public corruption cases, right? And your hope as a federal prosecutor was that your boss would unambiguously support your public corruption work, whether it happened to be a Democrat or a Republican. And if your boss didn't, as a federal prosecutor, you had some end runs that you could do. You could go up to Washington to the public integrity section. I'm familiar with one extreme case where prosecutors spoke directly with the DAG's office because the leadership always supported public corruption work without regard to who the target of the case was. And that's no longer, quite frankly, the situation. We now live in a world where it's quite clear that Pam Bondi will protect the president's friends and possibly engage in revenge prosecutions of his enemies. I can't tell you how painful it is to say that, and how surreal it feels to say that. And the fear is that we're not just talking about public corruption cases. What happens if one of Donald Trump's buddies is the target of a human trafficking case or a bank fraud case? Do they get a special pass? And then on top of that, sort of if we have the heat map of politicization at the Justice Department, there's this new focus on immigration at the expense of other work, where, for instance, the joint terrorism task forces and the drug task forces that look at cartel-linked drug trafficking crimes are being directed to refocus their work on immigration cases, some of a pretty modest level, right? Because the Justice Department was already doing the big important immigration cases. If you're a violent criminal who's in this country without legal status, you can be pretty confident the Justice Department's going to hunt you down and prosecute you. Now we're talking about doing people who are here, who are working, who are holding jobs. They may not have legal status, but they're not out causing mayhem in the community. That's what federal prosecutors are being directed to focus on. And yesterday there was this really sort of shocking all employees letter that went out inside of the Justice Department suggesting that they would surge resources to important places like Burlington, Vermont, to help with illegal border crossings. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a deeply troubling period. If you believe that the Justice Department's work should never be politicized, and I am a firm believer in that approach, then we are in trouble in times.
Okay, so I want to pick one instance and one case because I think it's going to help illustrate this for a public and for viewers who are not lawyers and who don't understand what is abnormal. So let's take the Eric Adams prosecution. So Eric Adams, Democratic mayor of New York City, is indicted on a series of public corruption charges by the Southern District of New York. Note, I am purposely not asking you about the office you served in so that you could be kind of like an not that you wouldn't be objective anyway, but like just an objective observer and expert here, okay? So he's indicted under the Biden Justice Department by the Southern District of New York for public corruption. The current Department of Justice, headed by, at the time, or not by the, at the time, but by an interim Deputy Attorney General, Emile Beauvais, directs the acting U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, who is a woman who was put in place by the Trump administration to be sort of the interim placeholder while they sort out who their U.S. attorney will be for the Southern District of New York, basically instructs her office to drop the charges against Eric Adams. She resigns. One of the line assistants who was, I guess, handling the case, he also resigns. They both write public letters explaining their resignation. So I think I've accurately described like the basic facts. So now I'm going to turn it over to you. Like, what happened here that is normal? What happened here that is abnormal? What gives you worry? What gives you hope? Like, what do you how should use that to illustrate to us how this is supposed to work?
So this is a case, it's a pretty straight up public corruption case involving bribery. Over the last decades, the Supreme Court has constricted very much prosecutors' abilities to bring these sorts of public corruption cases. We saw that, for instance, in the prosecution of the governor of Illinois, Rod Blagojevich, where they said, this is just political log rolling, not bribery. It's got to be a quid pro quo. Well, here, the Southern District of New York finds a quid pro quo, several of them involving the mayor. They charge that. And look, it's not just like the Southern District of New York woke up one day and said that they wanted to charge the case. I'm going to imagine, I don't know for certain, but because of the legal issues involved, they would have almost certainly gone to the Solicitor General to talk about the state of the law in this area and whether this case was one that the SG was comfortable with. I think most people, I don't want to say everyone, I know that there were some critics, most people thought that this was a righteous prosecution when it happened. We know how the dismissal works because Danielle Sassoon, the acting U.S. attorney in the Southern District, writes about it in her resignation letter. And
so you mentioned Danielle Sassoon. She was the woman I was referring to, right? You said she was the acting U.S. attorney. She's the person who I think I said had been chosen by the Trump administration, sort of shepherd through the beginning of his administration. So anyway, you were saying she wrote a letter of resignation describing what happened with Eric Adams.
And she expresses a real lack of comfort about the fact that this case is in essence being bargained away. A good case, a righteous case, is being bargained away so that the defendant can help the President of the United States with his political policy work, in essence. We don't do that in the Justice Department. There are reasons that you might dismiss cases or plead cases, but they involve that case and its merits. They don't involve someone doing political favors for a politician.
How common or uncommon is it for the Deputy Attorney General, who is, I think, the number 2 person at the Department of Justice, to tell the U.S. Attorney or a line assistant how to handle a case like this?
Look, I don't want to say it doesn't happen. There are 94 U.S. attorneys' offices across the country. They come in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes they have presidentially confirmed U.S. attorneys. Other times they have actings or interims, and that might involve a different level of oversight or supervision from Washington. So I'm covering the bases here before I say that in a situation like this, telling a U.S. attorney to dismiss a case is utterly unprecedented and it's wrong.
Okay. Then he also then goes to public integrity and which is in Washington, D.C., and tells them, apparently, they need to file this paperwork dismissing the case after the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York doesn't. And that, from what I gather, was a fairly unusual set of circumstances as well. And I don't know if you can elaborate there.
Public integrity is a section within the criminal division. Let me just do a little bit of DOJ's org chart. There's the criminal division, there's the civil rights division, the antitrust division. They're all supervised directly by the Deputy Attorney General, as are the 93 U.S. attorneys' offices. 94 offices, 93 U.S. attorneys, because Guam and the Mariana Islands share a U.S. attorney. So there's your Jeopardy trivia on U.S. attorneys for the day. But those U.S. attorneys are in the same place on the org chart with, for instance, the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division, who oversees public integrity, a unit of the Criminal Division. And that unit does public corruption work all across the country for reasons that are pretty easy to grasp, right? If I'm the sitting U.S. attorney in Birmingham and I have a public corruption case, it's possible that I could have a conflict of interest. And so you need to have folks who are good at doing this work, who can come in and do it, even if it's uncomfortable, let alone an outright conflict. But on the criminal side of the office, the criminal division in Washington doesn't come in and take away cases from U.S. attorneys. I'm not talking about civil cases. When we are talking about criminal cases, the U.S. attorney runs the show. You can invite public integrity in, but they typically can't force their way in any more than folks in Washington can tell a U.S. attorney how to handle a public corruption case in their district, especially when that case has been indicted by a grand jury and it's underway.
Got it. So this was very unusual. And then the final thing I wanted to ask you about this, because this is the thing where I have very mixed feelings. So you have a very principled conservative acting U.S. attorney. She resigns. You have a very principled, clearly conservative line assistant who resigns from the Southern District of New York over this. And his letter of resignation actually seems to indicate he probably was like otherwise a supporter of Donald Trump's. I mean, he actually sort of goes out of his way to sort of defend the president, but is very critical of what the Deputy Attorney General is doing. The Deputy Attorney General then goes to public integrity, where it appears that what happens is they have a big meeting in which they need to pick someone to agree to dismiss the case. I think it doesn't seem like there are any political appointees in that process, in that room, and a long-standing member of the public integrity section who I guess figures like he's closer to retirement or whatever. He will be the one to agree to dismiss the case to spare his colleagues also having to resign or be fired. Okay, so that's like the facts. I am of the view that the heroes of this story are Sassoon and the woman acting U.S. attorney, the gentleman from the Southern District of New York who resigns. I am not necessarily a big fan that one of the public integrity folks stepped up and did this to spare his colleagues, because like in the end, the whole purpose of the resignations in the Southern District of New York was to sort of not go along with this improper or unusual request. And like, I don't know, I'm kind of like, if you're a career person and you're doing the thing that other career people are resigning over, are you really like, are you really helping the cause, or are you really not helping the cause? But I don't know. I mean, what did you make of that?
I tended to think that it was a really heroic thing to do.
Okay. Tell me why. Because you understand my point? Like the heroes are the ones who are like, no, 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 I'm not going to do it.
I know exactly why it might look that way, and this is a little bit inside baseball, and I'm going to actually go back to FTE of all things. I never thought I'd talk about FTE in a podcast. But somebody is going to dismiss this case, right? Emil Bove can do it himself. He doesn't need somebody in public integrity to do it for him. And in fact, he does this weird, unprecedented thing where the deputy attorney general, I guess gets on a train and goes up to Manhattan to argue a motion in court. I don't think that's ever happened before. But here's what happens in public integrity. The head of the unit resigns. The senior career person in the criminal division resigns. Bove gets all the folks in the unit into a room and says, you got an hour to decide who it's going to be. Somebody's going to sign this motion. Or I'm going to fire all of you.
Right.
And if he fires all of them, he can replace all of them. And public integrity, this unit that is working corruption cases across the country, would then be a wholly owned subsidiary of Bove, Bondi, and Trump. And that is a terrifying thought for anyone who has ever worked in or with the public integrity section. And so knowing all of this, it was, I think, a real moment of bravery for someone who was close to retirement to step up and do this. I assume he was eligible to retire, so he wasn't doing it at risk to his pension. And he, in essence, took one for the team so everybody else could stay in place. I'm going to say one other thing. This may not be popular, but I'm just going to say this. I've got 4 kids. Our second kid was born with a really bad congenital heart defect. As a young prosecutor, I carried the insurance for a kid who had $1 million in medical bills in his first year of life. In a situation like this, I would like to think that I would have stood up and resigned. I might have killed my kid by doing that if we had lost our medical insurance and our access to high-end surgery. And so I just tell that personal story to say people are in all different situations. And, the acting U.S. attorney in New York was actually very close to having a baby. It was maybe a good time for her to step away and had family support. When you take a job at the Justice Department, you aren't making very much money in the first place. You're not building generational wealth in that job. And so I'm very empathetic to the plight that some of these folks may find themselves in. I hope that they will get the support that they deserve from the legal community so they can do the right thing when the moment demands it.
Okay, so I want to ask you one last question, and then you've been very generous with your time. And it goes to the broader legal community. So we have seen the pressure put on government lawyers. And I do think, you can see in some of these transcripts, in the civil cases, the government lawyers are truly trying to do the best they can to walk a line of telling the truth to the court, representing a client who is not probably all that easy to get accurate information from, making arguments that they may or may not agree with, but they have to make. Like, you can see that playing out, and I give them credit for balancing all of those things. I look out at the landscape, though, of a lot of big law firms and a lot of the private legal community, and not without exceptions. There are exceptions. The American Bar Association has put out some excellent statements, and there have been some of the major law firms that have also stepped up. But it feels like there is less support among the legal establishment this time than there was even in 2017. And the threats are much bigger this time than they were in 2017. And I'm wondering if you think I am either missing that boat, that there's more support, or whether you feel like, in fact, some of these government lawyers and others are not actually getting, or nonprofit organizations are not getting the moral support or the legal support or the financial support, whatever it is that the legal community should be offering.
So, look, I think it's apparent that the law firms, like many other segments of society, are sort of reeling in the face of how efficient, how fast, how broad spread the action by this new administration has been. And we've seen in the last week or so 2 executive orders targeting specific law firms, which is just unbelievable, right? In essence,
including my former firm, I should be clear.
Right. We don't like the kind of work that you've historically engaged in, so we're going to make it impossible for you to represent your clients. And I guess what's a little bit astounding to me is that, like when the Associated Press was singled out from the other press organizations, they finally did file a lawsuit. We've not seen a lawsuit here yet for the law firms. I hope we will at some point before long. We shouldn't let this stand as precedent, as something a president is able to do. But the reality is, and it doesn't matter if you're a newspaper or a law firm or a business or a university. I saw Columbia got slapped this afternoon with a threat to pull grant funding.
$400 million.
Just a small amount. Look, we will all stand together or we will all hang separately. It is, in fact, a soft coup, but that doesn't mean that it's a nice coup. And Donald Trump is intent on taking out every possible voice of opposition. We are watching that happen inside the Justice Department, in private practice, out in society. I hope we will not miss the moment at which it's essential that we all stand up and protest that and insist on having a democracy.
Well, Joyce, you are one of the smartest and most essential voices in this. I mean, I read your Substack. Everyone should be subscribing. We'll put links there. I obviously listen to you on your podcast, and every time I can hear you, I get smarter. And you're willing to speak out. You're willing to speak at a time when a lot of people, as you say, are not. And I just want you to know how much I appreciate everything you're doing, and how much better we are as an opposition if we make it through this because of you. So thank you for joining me today, and thank you for everything you're doing.
Well, I appreciate that more than I can say, but I feel the same way about you. I never miss an episode of this podcast.
Well, thank you. Thanks for watching this episode of Defending Democracy. Please make sure you're subscribed to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletters. We'll see you next time.